Can you hear me better? Okay. Okay. Better, and now they can hear me outside of here too. So I went away to Ball State for undergrad. I mentioned starting out environmental sciences, but clearly I was called to a different place. And so I found my way into social work, probably because my dad has been a licensed clinical social worker for 45 years now. But eventually psychology was the place I really felt like I should land, and both from the scientific side, both from just the side of being interested in working with people, and so things took off from there. So from undergrad at Ball State, went to St. Louis University in St. Louis for grad school, and my wife and I actually got married in 2000, so next year will be our 25th wedding anniversary. And so we celebrated our wedding, and then about 3 weeks later we moved over to St. Louis and began our new life together there. And St. Louis was really a great place for us. And so we spent 4 years there, and I went to Louisville for our pre-doctoral internship, and then went back to St. Louis at St. Louis Children's Hospital, WashU, for fellowship. And so then from there, you know, it was interesting. We described 2 to 3 phases of our marriage. The first phase is the phase without kids, and that was the first 6 years of our life. And then my wife, after about a year of being worried that she wasn't going to get pregnant, suddenly we found out 3 weeks into the pregnancy that she wasn't just pregnant, but she was pregnant with twins. And literally it was 3 weeks into the pregnancy, and our twins were about a ½ centimeter in size in utero. And we didn't have any twins in our family. It was completely, you know, like just a de novo finding there. And we'll never forget, you know, her shaking in the OB room, like, I don't think I can carry twins. I don't think I can carry twins, but she did. And so our twins were born at 38.5 weeks, Zach and Emma weighing like 6'1" and 5'8" as far as their pounds there. And so from that point forward, it was phase 2 of our life, because phase 2 meant that was about, I guess, 7.5 years, we had 6 kids. Things got rolling pretty quickly. And then we moved back to Evansville in 2008, and the kids kept coming, and I was at St. Vincent's. At that time, it was St. Mary's Center for Children, eventually becoming St. Vincent's in Ascension. I was there for 10 years before I began to talk with the CEO at Easter Seals about kind of a vision to start a training program here, a pre-doctoral internship, postdoctoral fellowship, and so I've been there now for about 6.5 years. So in between, I mean, life has been busy from the beginning. We joke that like being bored sounds like a fantastic idea, but we don't know what that really is. But the story tonight really begins, and it really begins, if I can remember kind of the sequence I was going to tell you about, it begins with 2 difficult situations. And I look out to you and ask you, how many times in life has something positive come out of something that was not positive at the time at all? It was quite negative. So picture this. I'm in the middle of St. Louis, in the heart of the city, and I'm at, probably don't know where this is at, but Manchester, McCausland, about a mile from our house. And I'm sitting there at the light, and the light turns green, and I pull away from the light. And suddenly out of the left, I see something large and moving very quickly, which happened to be a van that was blowing through the intersection. And so as I pull away at the green light, too quickly I realize there's the van, and the van crushes in the side of our Toyota Corolla. And fortunately, it hits the back part of the Corolla, so I'm not hurt, but immediately it's clear that the car is totaled. And, you know, the car itself was probably only worth a few $1,000s, but for us being pretty poor at that point, just finishing up school, just starting a new position, it was worth gold, right? Well, the second part of it that got even more difficult was that in the Missouri, the law is that even if you have the right-of-way, even if it's a green light, if you don't allow the intersection to clear, you're partially at fault. So what that meant was that we did not even get the full settlement from the Corolla, which wasn't worth hardly much anyway. I think we got like 60% of it, and we were left with not a whole lot of, you know, available cash for the car. So I had this friend, Rodney, and Rodney, you know, all of us have these friends in our lives that challenge us to do things that are a little bit different, right? That challenge us to kind of take on something that we think, not sure that's going to work. But Rodney said to me, he said, before you get a second car, which is what we assumed we had to do because we grew up in Evansville and most people had 2 cars, he said, why don't you take the bus system in St. Louis and make that work? And I thought, Rodney, you're kind of insane. right? Because number one, I've never done that, and I've never really learned the bus systems. St. Louis can be kind of complex. Number two, I was just starting my very first position. So I had finished fellowship. We had little babies at home, and I was starting at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Oh, very cool, thank you. And yeah, I'll just tell you, that's fine. So I'll give you a thumbs up whenever you click it. So a leap of faith, I decided, you know what, I guess what's the worst thing? I can try it, and we'll see how this one goes. And so through Rodney's encouragement, I began to learn the bus system and began to figure out how I could get from our house and do some different bus lines depending on what's going on and get to Cardinal Glennon, which fortunately was probably just 5 or 6 miles away. And from there began a real interesting part of our journey because, we had grown up in a 2-car family for our entire lives. But as I began to kind of get to know that system and really appreciate it more and kind of the freedom that came with it, I began to be more active. I was walking to the bus stop, walking home, different things. Began to kind of recognize that there's a whole other world on the St. Louis City bus that I didn't grow up in. And we moved back to Evansville. It was a couple of years later, and my parents, I think, and everybody thought, oh, well, you're just going to buy a car. Well, maybe not, right? And so at that point, I walked in my office at St. Vincent's, and for those of you who knew where the center, or know where the Center for Children is on the front of campus, it used to be a nursing home. And when I walked in my office and realized that this converted nursing home and my office had an actual, and this is pretty fortunate, but a bathroom and a shower that was adjoined, I thought, you know what, maybe we're not getting another car. And so for the next 10 years, upwards of 6 kids, we had 1 car, which meant that most days I was biking, running, busing into work. And it opened up an entire world that really began, the book certainly sprung that, but we're going to talk about this tonight. And so for 10 years we had 1 car. We eventually got a second car, but most days I still bike into work or run into work at Easter Seals to this day. And so as I was reflecting about this talk tonight and thinking about this, the title of the book is Confessions of a Carless Commuter, What 40,000 Motorless Miles Taught Me About Life. And it's been about 3 years, so it's probably about 50,000 miles at this point. And I was thinking, wow, God has so blessed me that, the Earth's circumference, if I'm remembering correctly, is just under 25,000 miles. And so I've had it a couple times around the Earth reflecting on what I have learned from this journey. So that's kind of a little preface as we begin. And you go back. Okay, sounds good. But I think the key here for me is that we often start with what we don't necessarily want, and it leads to a whole other realization about things that we may not plan at all, right? We may not there. So we can go to the next slide here. So right down half a mile from here, all of you know exactly where Sycamore Street is, I'm sure, right where it hits Van. So the book story begins, one night I'm kind of racing home on my bike. I've got wrestling practice, so I coach wrestling for Holy Redeemer, have for the last 8 years. And I've got practice that night, and I'm headed down Van Street. And right at Sycamore, that last street before the Lloyd, I start to make a left turn. And as I'm making the left turn, in my mind I'm thinking, okay, you're in a hurry, you're cutting it sharp. And as I start to make that left turn, I realize there's a car coming on Sycamore this way. And instantly, of course, as the car is coming, I have to readjust my position. But in readjusting the position and kind of going to the side, I'm going pretty quickly, and the bike goes out from under me, and I just slide right to the curb. And so fortunately, I'm not seriously hurt, except road rash just all the way down my left side. But literally, as I am sliding to the curb, I hear this, and I just hear it as clear as day, don't cut corners, don't cut corners. And literally, don't cut corners, and that moment meant a whole lot to me. But it began what really led to this book and led to a broader reflection, that there was so much that I was learning in this carless commuting about life and about faith, that ultimately that was part of the journey. And that was really the moment where I recognized this is going to go down on paper and become part of a bigger story. So we can go on to the next one. So there's this quote in the Bible that says, therefore you shall be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's Matthew 5:48. And I don't know about you, but for the longest time, whenever I would hear that verse, it felt very intimidating in some ways, right? Number one, we're never going to be perfect, as the Father is perfect. But number two, that pursuit of perfection itself feels very intimidating. But then, and so much of this circulates how science and how our faith and how life intersect, as I begin to get deeper into the research behind perfectionism, I recognize actually there's something quite freeing about this verse after all. But you have to look at it a different way. And so here's the backdrop. The backdrop is that when you think of perfectionism, there's really two main veins of perfectionism, the way that we pursue it. One of those veins is that we call it perfectionistic concerns. So perfectionistic concerns is when I am worried about upholding an image of who I think I am or who others think I should be. And when you're really focused on your image, right, on your image, the way you look to others, the problem with that is it tends to increase your anxiety. It tends to increase your negative adjustment. You're so focused on being worried about failing and keeping your image alive that that's all you can think about, and it really kind of dwells on you. But when I reflect on this Bible verse and the other element of perfectionism, which is perfectionistic striving, the beautiful thing about the research behind perfectionistic striving is that when we strive for excellence out of love, right, out of just the desire to know the ultimate design, the desire to pursue something for the beauty of that, actually it becomes very, very much a positive thing for us psychologically, for us spiritually, for us just holistically. That when we pursue something because we love it so much or because you love someone so much, that pursuit of perfection that way, from a scientific standpoint, actually is a wonderful thing for us. So it was years later in getting into that research that I recognized that this pursuit, this idea of perfection, is not in order for us to hold up an image of ourselves in a certain way, but really to pursue God fully and God's design of the world. And as I was kind of reflecting as this journey was unfolding in itself, that's what I kind of recognized that so much of this journey was about. It was about understanding God's design of ourselves and God's design of the world, and not being afraid to fail along the way in that pursuit. And I think that when it comes to our faith, so often we live out of fear of failure. I tell people this, and I did a podcast for Evansville. If you get on their website, it was posted yesterday. I talked a lot about this experience. But for decades, I lived too much as first and foremost focused on, I don't want to fail. Like, what happens if I fail? So I would get done with something, and I would accomplish something, and then I would feel relief, but then the next thing was in front of me. And I worried so much about, well, how could I fail that? And on the outside, people probably thought, oh, he's doing okay. Like, he seems to be kind of like, going through life. On the inside, it just felt very empty, because it felt like I was just kind of pursuing the next achievement and not enjoying the process. I wasn't enjoying the pursuit. But as I started to recognize in the last really couple decades of the journey I've been through, that I couldn't sustain that, and I couldn't keep that as my number one focus. That instead of being afraid to fail, and that being my focus constantly, I had to shift it as God's design would have it in pursuing perfection, and just be excited about the possibilities in store. Be excited about opportunities that lay in front of me, and if I failed, I failed, which we're going to sometimes, but not be worried about, being the failure, being the first and foremost focus. So, next slide. It's probably nice and delayed for you there. Not go anywhere. Okay. Tell me if it goes somewhere. So, one of the things that, as I began this carless commuting, that I recognized, is that we often set arbitrary limits in our life. We often we wonder, who are setting the limits? Am I setting the limits, or is someone else setting limits? And I want to give you the story. It pertains to temperature here, and as it pertains to this book. So when I was back in St. Louis and I started to bike for fun, this was before I was commuting by bike, Amy and I, when it got to about 55 degrees, the bike usually went up. It was like, okay, it's getting cooler, we'll put the bike up. And so then it went up for the season, it would come back, it was nicer. And as I moved back here, and recognized that I might start commuting by bike, I started to think about, well, is that really the low temperature? Like, could I reasonably be comfortable going lower? And so I began to get down, and it was 50s and into the 40s, and I recognized like I could be pretty comfortable going in the 40s. And then I recognized, well, into the 30s, into the 20s. Even below that, I could find a way, again, for 7 miles to be reasonably comfortable. So I kept setting at some point, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go below 20. That's crazy, right? Who's going to go that? And then I realized, well, 15 wasn't too bad. And so 15 gave way to 10. I was like, well, I'm never going to single digits. That's just insane, right? And then in one day, like single digits was 9 or 8 degrees. And I'm like, well, okay, I think, and single digits became that mark. And so finally one morning I woke up, and it was like January 2nd, and it was -1 degrees. And I thought to myself, you don't really have to do this, right? You really don't have to go out. It's so cold that when I got to work, the card reader wouldn't work to let me in, so I had to go around the back way. But as I stepped outside and it was -1 degrees, the question was, who's setting this limit? Now again, sanity says maybe I should have been setting a limit, and there are good reasons to set limits. But the reality is that I was setting that limit. And I recognize that one of the ways that I have experienced God so greatly through this journey is that the more cold, the more dark, the more deprivation is around you. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. The more I personally feel God's presence. Like I love God's presence on a beautiful, sunny, 70-degree day, and I love that and that he provides for us. But when it's -1 outside, and you're cycling down Stringtown Hill, headed towards Pigeon Creek, there's only one creator that can keep you warm, and that's the creator that created you, right? And so as I reflected on this journey and I reflect on this idea of arbitrary limits, I started to recognize that so many of the limits that I was setting for myself, it was me setting those. It wasn't God. You know, before we had our 8 kids, before Amy and I ever had any kids, I knew that she wanted a big family. And I knew that it also frightened me completely to think of how big she probably wanted at that point. So I come from a family of 4. I thought, okay, 4 sounds great. But my wife, she came from a family of 6. I joked she probably would have been happy with 15. And so we've landed on 8 at this point. But prior to having any kids, there was a lot of fear. Like, there's no way I can handle this, right? The limit's got to be 4. It's got to be 2. Whatever it is, it's got to be that. But you start to find out in life that those limits that you're setting for yourself, again, sometimes they're for good reasons. Sometimes they are for health reasons or for spiritual reasons. But so often I started to reflect on my own life, and I thought, I'm the only one setting those limits. And so it's interesting when people ask me now, so what's the temperature span you biked in? As far as I know, it's from 108 to -1, and that's my temperature span. And so, you know what? I mean, it makes for an interesting ride, right? But it also helps me recognize that, again, there's just amazing the possibilities that lie out there if you're open to it, and of course, if God's calling you. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And yet, we're going to talk just briefly today about there are common factors that get in the way of this every single day that result in us setting those limits, the limits that I was describing. And this happens, I think, without us even realizing this. And I'll give you a simple acronym to remember these 3 factors. And that is, it's kind of a fad for today. And fad stands for fatigue. And I'm not talking about just being tired like we all are. I'm talking about chronic, unrelenting fatigue. A stands for anxiety. Anxiety is the number one psychological complaint for children and adults in this country and in this world today. Over about 25% of our teens have serious difficulties with anxiety in general. And the D stands for distractions. We live in a distracted world of all kinds. And so when it comes to those common factors, what you'll find, and I've certainly found in my own life, is that we often have great intent or we have great desire. But fatigue and anxiety and distraction derail us continuously. And I think it's one of the reasons why, and this is where I love how, if people ever say that psychology and faith are adversarial, I would absolutely disagree. And I've got a few books in the back that will give you how I disagree with that. But actually, all the research, if it's sound science, as Father Tyler Timbarge and I were talking about one day, if it is sound science, It just reflects God's design of the world. That's all it does, right? We shouldn't be afraid of research that is sound because it simply is just illuminating the presence of how God designs things. And I think there's a reason why the number one most repeated phrase in the Bible is, do not be afraid, right? When I was a little boy growing up, I thought of that as purely spiritual advice in many ways. Like God says, do not be afraid, come to me. And of course it is spiritual advice. But then you become a psychologist, and then you have 8 kids, and you recognize that do not be afraid is social advice. It's psychological advice, right? It's physical advice. Chronic anxiety, just like chronic anger and all those other emotions that are what I call short-term emotions, were never intended to be that way. Because here's the problem. If I feel anxious chronically over time, if I'm constantly feeling rageful and wrathful, right? Think of the vices, right? All of those vices. The problem is that if I'm not using it for a particular purpose that is to resolve or to work towards something positive and it remains chronic, it really physically and psychologically affects me in many different ways. Cardiac, right? Immune system, all sorts of ways. But if I harness, and I don't even call these emotions because they're really states of being, if I harness love and admiration and trust and all of those states of being that we're called to really cultivate, the beautiful thing about it is that my body and my mind flourish from that. So when we really think about our goals today, I would argue that while we often set goals that are very worldly or tasks that are very worldly, I think all of us today should be focused on how should I reduce and what ways can I reduce unnecessary distraction, unnecessary fatigue, and unnecessary anxiety. And if we were to set that as our goal and to constantly cultivate that, what I believe we would find, and I have certainly found in my own life, is that your capacity to really grow as God calls you grows immensely there. And so this is, when we talk about virtuous living is grounded in exceeding arbitrary limits for ourselves, think of all the saints, right? Think of all those people, both canonized saints and remarkable people over the course of history who have been asked to exceed their limits, right? How many of you know the story of Viktor Frankl? Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, neurologist who lost almost his entire family in World War II in the Holocaust. He and his sister made it out, and he lost his wife and his parents and many close family members. And he came out of the war with every reason to be furious and angry and bitter and everything else. And yet, from the very beginning, he said, we have to find a way to forgive. And not just because it's the good thing for our community and for our world, but because if you live in anger and if you live in just constant bitterness, it will destroy you. It will destroy you. And so Viktor Frankl lived into his early 90s. He wrote what I consider to be one of the most top 5 most important books I've ever read in my life, called Man's Search for Meaning. And it's his perspective on what do you do when you're faced with unavoidable suffering? What do you do when you can't change the horrible things that have happened to you? And his quote, and this remains one of, maybe, I think it's probably the most important quote I've ever come across outside the Bible, is this. He said, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Again, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. And when I was introduced to him in grad school, I thought to myself, if this man who had every reason to hate and every reason to be bitter could decide to take that course, that I, with all of my little, things that were challenging, but certainly nothing compared to him, if he could choose that, right, then so can I. And so that began a journey, and I certainly have come to love him so much of what he's taught. Nelson Mandela spent how many years in prison? 29, 27, just a little under 30. Walked out of prison, had every reason to basically say, I'm angry at the world. Like, I don't believe this was fair. And the story of Nelson Mandela is the story of resiliency. He lived most of his life in that little cube. And he would say the same thing as Frankl. You can take everything away from me. You can take every privilege, everything I've got. But you cannot take away the soul. You cannot take away my ability to choose the perspective that I take in life. And these examples are so powerful. The story of St. Peter, of obviously the man who said he's the least equipped of all, right? Who becomes equipped to lead the church. And so all of them, I would challenge you to say, all of them had to exceed the arbitrary limits that they set for themselves. Now again, in order to do that, they have to co-partner. They had to co-partner with God and God's grace and what God created inside of them. But all of them had to say to themselves that the limits that I set for myself now should not apply for me in going forward. So when you're on the bike, there's really a lesson that you learn very quickly. And that is that your field of vision is extremely important. So again, I've probably biked the roadways 40 to 45,000 miles at this point. And there's a real lesson about this that it really take into the rest of my life. And that is, and I'm going to give you a very specific example about this. In life, we can often be justified in our response. We can be completely justified. We can be completely in the right. But being justified does not necessarily mean that's the most effective route to take. And so here's my example. This has happened countless of times over the years, having biked, for 20, 25 years. I'm riding down the road. I have the right of way, right? And I'm going down the road, and I start to recognize, and again, I consider myself responsible for everything around me. Every car, every person, everyone, I am responsible for them. And you may think, well, wait, how are you responsible? I am responsible for them because I have to be, because that's the most effective response. So I'm riding down the road, and I'm in my lane, and I'm going, and the car pulls out right in front of me, right? Now, I'm justified to be in the place that I am at, right? I legally am entitled to that space. But as a cyclist, you learn really quick that justified means nothing, right? Nothing. Because justified just means that you don't get a ticket, but it has nothing to do with your safety and your health and everything else there. And so that's one of those lessons that as I was reflecting on that on the road, I was recognizing that in life, we often feel that we're very justified in the responses that we have towards others. We feel justified to do the things that we do at work, right? We feel justified to act in the ways that we act in our family. But just being justified doesn't mean that's the most effective response, right? So if someone makes me angry and I have a right to be angry, maybe I have a right to act out towards them in a certain way. But just having that right doesn't necessarily mean that's the most effective response. And I think that that's one of the things I love about what cycling has provided and what other arenas have provided is that your field of vision often gets clouded by your own, if you go to the next slide, by your own sense of pride, by your own sense of biases, right? By all those things that kind of say, I'm in the right, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be, and I'm just going to go forward. And I want to give you a few examples of these biases beyond how pride plays a role. So the confirmatory bias, you probably are familiar with this, but the confirmatory bias is that we basically look for the information around us that we want to prove our opinion, right? It feels really good because you're like, well, see, I told you this was right because I found this here. The problem is that you're all the way wanting to confirm that you're right. You're not necessarily open. It's like you want to confirm your truth, not necessarily the truth. And that happens over and over with the confirmatory bias. The fundamental attribution error is that we tend, when people act negatively towards us, we tend to believe that it's part of their personality. So if someone we meet seems a little bit kind of gruff and standoffish or whatever else like that, right away we as human beings assume, well, that person's not somebody I want to hang around with, right? Little do we know that maybe their dad died 2 days later or 2 days earlier, right? That they're in financial ruin, that things have been going on in their life to create a really difficult situation, but we tend to attribute it to that person. The irony is that when we act certain ways, what do we attribute to? Something else, not us. Other people are bothering me. Life has been rough. It's been a busy week, right? So that's the error we make. Other people's, if they wrong us, we attribute it to them. If we wrong someone else, it's because something else is going on, right? And then the availability heuristic, I always remember when I got a Saturn. Do you remember back when they made Saturns, the car? That I got a Saturn and we were in St. Louis, and I started thinking, wow, there are a ton of Saturns on the road all of a sudden. Like, this is crazy how many Saturns I see everywhere. Well, the reality was there was just as many Saturns the year before I got it, I just was paying attention because that was my car, right? And that's the example of the availability heuristic. So here's what happens in life as we go on to the next slide, is that I would argue that God's design says, if you're truly open to the world I put in front of you, and you're truly open to people, and you're truly open to the way that I call you, it's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's going to be difficult. But what you're going to be able to do, if you create and you cultivate that openness, is you're going to be able to see a fuller vision of the way I've created things, the way I'm creating you right now. But pride, ultimately, is the biggest deterrent to that fuller vision, right? Pride says, I like it the way I like it because it's that, it is that way, and I believe it's the truth and everything else. And so we tend to close ourselves in around pride instead of opening ourselves up to this broader vision. But the beauty of it is that the antidotes are two big things. And one is humility. And I love the C.S. Lewis definition about humility. Humility, he says, is not thinking of less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. Meaning, right? It's not demeaning yourself. Humility is all about truth, right? You are who you are. But humility is about focusing on the mission more than yourself, right? Focusing on what you're called more than thinking about yourself. And I think that's a beautiful definition of humility. And curiosity truly is the antidote to pride in many ways, right? If I am truly curious about God's design in the world, then I'm open to realities that may not necessarily serve me well and may not necessarily feel great, but certainly allow me to see his design in everything around us. Yep. So as we move on, as we kind of move through the lessons of the Carlos community, things that was being taught in a fuller way, there's a core message of Jesus' teaching to pursue the truth in him, and in this world, we must humble ourselves to see things again as they are, just not how we want them to be, right? How many times in the Bible, think of how many times he really uses parables, and he uses so many different ways to communicate a sense of how the world and how things are created, but it requires humility for us to see that. Next slide. And beyond humility and beyond curiosity, it also requires communication. And I love this quote, and the question is, when we think of our communication, how empathetic, right? How effective is that communication? Again, it goes back to that idea of I can be justified in saying something, but is it the most effective thing? And George Bernard Shaw once said, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place at all, right? I think sometimes, and I see this so much even in our own lives, I see this in my work as a psychologist, that many times people think that they are communicating, but it's not communication, right? It may be spouting, or it may be saying things, but it's not a two-way street. And so part of communication is really recognizing that if it's going to be a true mutual exchange, that we really, really have to be intentional about that we don't fall backwards into good communication. And so on the roadways, you recognize that, as I was saying earlier, when you're out biking on the roadways or running, that communication is absolutely key, right? So what I'm doing, whether I'm using my hand signs or whether I am communicating in the way I'm on the road, I am making it very clear of what I'm doing and my intentions so that others around me understand that as much as possible too. And without that, you can't take solace on the road and say, well, they're going to notice me. They're going to take care of me, because that communication has to occur continuously throughout that process. The beautiful thing about communication is that it really relates to the fact that God's design is that we are social beings even before you're born. I don't know if you know this, but about 6 months of gestation, 6 months along in gestation, they've done research where they have found that babies soothe differently to the sound of their mother than anyone else outside, obviously outside of utero there. And so by 6 months, that baby recognizes the sound of his or her mother and begins to soothe differently. And by the time that baby's born, the mother, within 24 hours, can recognize the sound of her baby's cry in the nursery different than the babies around that other child. It's remarkable. We are wired by God to be social beings. We are wired to be fully social. And so we're also wired to recognize that communication is so incredibly important for our lives as Christians, right? And what we do and how we speak runs itself throughout the Bible. So when we talk about effective communication, we're not going to get in this too deep, but there really are 4 hallmarks of effective communication. And one is that simply we really have to focus on saying what we mean and recognizing that like hyperbole and minimization and exaggeration are great for stories, but not great for effective relationships, not great for effective communication. So many times, we'll hear ourselves say, oh, you never listen to me. You always, right? Always, never, those kinds of words. And unless you're talking about things that are in the physical world, when it comes to the social world, those absolutist words rarely are true, and unfortunately rarely lead to good communication. We have to understand that each of us owns our emotions, and no matter what has occurred, another individual is not responsible for how we feel, right? No one makes us feel angry. No one, creates that. We have an element of choice in the ways that we react, even if that feeling instantly comes to us there. We also have to recognize that when you think about we give feedback to another person, we should focus our critique, our feedback, on what that person's doing, not on who they are, right? So if I'm frustrated that, we agreed to clean up the kitchen together and I say that that person's a slob, then I'm focused on who they are as a person, and that instantly demeans and instantly derails that. But instead, we should be focused on what it is in those situations that we most need. And we strive to be transparent and honest, right? If we make a mistake, we're called in our Christian lives to own that. If we do something well, right, then you know what? Embrace that and love that. So really, we're pursuing the truth ultimately when it comes to communication. And the 4 horsemen, this is John Gottman, talks about the research behind communication. The 4 horsemen are the things that we all do at some points in our lives, but the more you do it, the more it really, really derails us. The more it really creates negative relationships. So by criticism, I'm talking about criticizing the person, not the situation. By stonewalling, I'm basically saying that another person's trying to have a conversation with me, and it's not just that I'm taking a break, I'm just shutting down. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to psychologically pay it. I'm just shutting down like the stone wall that I'm being. Defensiveness is when you rise up against something, someone has a complaint, and you rise up, maybe even reactively blame them for things that they are saying that you're doing that are causing concerns. And the worst of them, he would say, is contempt. Contempt is the idea of when we show disgust towards another person, right? We just show disgust and disdain for who they are. And so at some point, we're all guilty of these things. But when it comes to communication, when it comes to the way that we communicate with the world, the more that we do this, the worse that our relationships get. And so the question for communication is, whenever we're communicating about anything of importance, what's my intent, right? What's the simplest, clearest way I can communicate what I'm trying to say? How can I make this interaction, even if it's a difficult one, as enjoyable as possible? I think about this with my kids a lot, that so many times I find myself frustrated and certainly sometimes not reacting the way I want to. But if I want to have influence on my kids for the rest of their lives, not just when I legally have that influence, then the way that I try to make that interaction as mutual and loving as possible probably not only has to do with the influence that I have on them now, but probably leads itself to the influence I'll have on them decades later. And so finally, what can I do to preserve the safety and sanctity of the person involved when it comes to communication? We have to ask ourselves these really Christian questions. How am I using communication in the most effective way? And so we're not going to read this passage, but one thing I want to point out about the Bible is that we so get wedded to the content of the Bible, which of course we should, that we forget that I think there's so much of the process that Jesus goes through that we don't pay attention. So when you get home tonight, I would love for you to read this classic story. We know the woman at the well. We've heard this many times over the years. And what I would love for you to do is instead of focusing on what Jesus is saying, what I would love for you to focus on is how he's saying it. How is he communicating this? How is he being transparent? How is he creating safety in this difficult communication? How is he clearly showing his intent? What you find throughout the Bible is that when you start to focus on the process of Jesus' communication, Christianity takes on this even broader understanding. Because the word itself is the living word, right? But how that word is being communicated, I would argue, has so much to do with how we as Christians emulate Jesus from the Bible. And so we have to kind of consider that and the importance there. And so, what time are we at right now? I know that I'm... Okay. I have 10 minutes left. Is that right? Roughly. Okay. I want to make sure I respect everyone's time here. Speaking of time and space. And time and space, William Penn once said, time is what we want the most, but we use the worst, right? Think of how much we want to do. Think of our intent and how much does time seem to get in the way. But I would argue to all of us here that it's actually not time that gets in the way. It's what I call psychological time and space. So I definitely understand as a father of 8 in my life as a psychologist and all this, that we are very busy. And I recognize that there are just things that we don't have time to do. But what I've come to realize in the last 10 to 20 years is that it's not the amount of time that I have that gets in the way of answering God's call or gets in the way of my good intent. It's my psychological, it's my spiritual time and space. And if I don't have enough of it, and I describe this more fully in the book, if I don't have enough and I'm not cultivating that, it will reduce my ability to follow through with my intent and with my God's call, and it will make it difficult to really pursue where I'm supposed to pursue. But when we cultivate that time and space, and I would argue that those 50,000 miles on the bike or running or by myself and spending time with God, I am cultivating that time and space with him. And I'm cultivating the understanding that when I free myself of all the worldly things and I really focus on that time with him, suddenly I have more time than I could have ever imagined. And I will say this, to be honest, that my productivity and all the things that I've been blessed to do, and whether it relates to the books or whatever, even as my life has gotten busier, it has exploded. And I believe it's a gift that God has given me because I've cultivated that time and space with him, that on the outside it looks like I've never been busier, but on the inside I feel like I have more time and space than I've ever had before. And that's been incredibly meaningful. Because guess what? As Americans, right, we are doing all kinds of things all the time. The average adult checks his phone 150 times a day. The average American watches 5 hours of TV or internet per day. The average American spends 2 hours of social media per day. I think we've got the time. I just don't know that we're quite using it the right way. So as we wrap up here tonight, and we're going to go to the next slide. We go back to this fad, right? Remember these. If you take anything away tonight, fatigue, anxiety, distraction. These are the 3 culprits. These are the 3 things that C.S. Lewis says this once in. He said, he has this great quote in Screw Tape Letters. He said, basically, it doesn't really matter what distracts them, right, as the devil, as the demon's talking. Distract them with anything. It doesn't matter what you distract them with. Just keep them distracted. Because the more you keep them distracted, the more that you keep them away from God's call, the more that you keep them away from who God intends them to be. So it can be mindless distractions. Just keep it going. And so those distractions really are the culprits of what goes on. So I'm going to end with this thought, and then I'm going to kind of point to the book if you guys are interested in a few other stories. Do you know this tree? You do without even knowing you know it? Of course. So I tell people my favorite tree in all of Evansville is the cherry bark oak that was basically began growing around the time of the Revolutionary War. This 200-foot wide, 100-foot tall, beautiful state champion tree that stands by itself by the pond there. And I know sometimes people they get kind of complacent about what is extraordinary. But I want to go back to that acorn, right? That acorn 275, 50 years ago, that acorn only had one destiny, and that was the destiny of a cherry bark oak that was in that place. That acorn was not going to be a tulip tree. It was not going to be any other catalpa. It was going to be nothing else, but if it thrived, someday 250 years later, it was going to be this gorgeous, gorgeous cherry bark oak that sits on the state hospital grounds. The reality is that, as Ehud Dogan says, in the mundane, nothing is sacred. But in sacredness, nothing is mundane. And as the book will tell you much further, nothing about you, nothing about this world is mundane. Because when you get below the surface, your name is, of course, Ann Baumgart, and if I took all of your cells in your body, all the trillion cells you have, and I was able to unravel all the DNA in your nuclei in your trillions of cells, this is a basic physical fact that if I put your DNA end to end, your DNA alone would get you from here to the sun and back 90 times. There's nothing mundane about us. There's nothing ordinary about us. We are extraordinary beings because we're created in the image and likeness of God. And that's where we have to remain. So when you start to look at the world in a different way, my Carlos commuting, if it's given me anything, it's given me this world that I am staring at sacred people in sacred spaces, not just in the churches, which of course are the sacred spaces that we love most, but the world and the people around me are pure sacredness. And once you start to see the world that way, the possibilities are endless. The love never really stops. And you find yourself in places and doing things that you could have never imagined. And so the last story, one more. If you happen to get the book, I looked at the odds of this one time. I thought, and the story involves oatmeal, 133, deer flying over my head, Google, Lauren Daigle, and a beautiful desert canyon, not to mention a few other things thrown in. And when I consider the odds of this all coming together in the story that's told in the last chapter here of this book, which you'll have to read for another time if you're interested, there was only one odd that could make sense, one odds, and that was divine. It's too astronomical to put it together. So thank you so much, guys, for tonight, for being here. I really appreciate it, and happy to talk more in books. Thanks. I know we're out of time, and I want to respect everybody's time, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them or any thoughts, and certainly my books. And I've got artwork in the back. St. Bonaventure has an amazing thing to say about the Trinity, so that's the artwork that I have back there. I'll explain. So, yeah, you're welcome.
Did you used to ride a reclining bicycle on Belly?
I never did. No, I know who you're talking about, though. I would see him periodically there, yes.
Every morning you'd see him.
Yes.
Everywhere he was going, exactly.
His big flag that would come up, right? You saw, yes. No, my bikes have always been kind of the typical type. I've had a few over the years I've used, but I have one that I've had probably that has been about 30,000 miles or so on this one bike. So.
Do you know who that guy was or where he went?
I would see him all the time. I don't know who he was. No. You start to see the same people. Yeah. Yep, many times. So, yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. That's right. What does us good and what doesn't, right? Yeah, in any situation. I think those are the kinds of questions we really need to ask ourselves more often. It's kind of like, for example, and won't go too long on this, any emotion that we feel, let's take anxiety again. What do we want to do most with anxiety? There's two things we do on all accounts. We either want to control it or avoid it, right? So that's what we do with anxiety. The problem is God's design, I'm convinced, says you're not supposed to just control or avoid it. You're supposed to ask yourself, now again, I realize every time things seem busy, but you're supposed to ask yourself, what's it telling you? Because if you start to really ask yourself, like, what's the anxiety telling me? What's the meaning inherent there? Then you might find, again, it may be uncomfortable, but you might be asked to be growing in certain areas, or you might be asked to be doing other things. But human nature has a way of just saying, I want to control it, I want to avoid it, let's get it passed, right? And unfortunately, that kind of leads us to difficult places. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll be good at that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.